Okay, so would like to welcome everyone to the webinar today. First of all, I would like to apologize. Normally, I would be doing this with somebody else who has more of the logistical management control. And unfortunately, the individual who's going to help me today is ill and unable to join. However, happily, I do have a set of panelists who are here from the Standard Development Group and would like to welcome you all today and appreciate it if you can kind of help me keep track of things a little bit, and that would be fantastic. But my name is Amy Clark-Eagle. I am the Director of Science and Certification with the Forest Stewardship Council US office. And would like each one of you as panelists to please give a very brief introduction. You're all members of the Standard Development Group and members of our Board of Directors. But Tim, why don't you give us a really brief introduction for you?
Yes, good afternoon. Hopefully all afternoon for all of you. I'm Tim Beyer. I'm the certification consultant for Minnesota DNR. I serve as chair of the Policy and Standards Committee. I'm in the middle of my second and final term with the FSC Board of Directors.
Great, thank you. Shona?
Hi, I'm Shona Humphreys. I'm in Berkeley, California. I'm finishing up the 4th year on the board, and I represent the Social Chamber. Thanks everyone for being here today.
Fantastic. And Stuart?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name's Stuart Hell. I'm a forester with the Nature Conservancy in North America, and starting my 2nd year here on the board with the Environmental Chamber. Thanks again for joining us today. I think Amy might have had to deal with her coworker for just a second.
Yes, my coworker, who I totally intended to put in a crate and make sure that they were quiet before this began. So apologies to all of you. All right, moving on. Before we get going, would like to remind everyone that as participants in this meeting, we need to be mindful of the constraints of antitrust laws. There shall be no discussions of agreements or concerted actions that may restrain competition. This prohibition includes the exchange of information concerning individual prices, rates, market practices, or any other competitive aspect of an individual company's operation. Each participant is obligated to speak up immediately for the purpose of preventing any discussion falling outside these bounds. Right. Thank you for keeping that in mind. So today, recognizing that not everyone would have been able to join us for our first webinar, I am going to repeat just a little bit of information about the process of revising our FSC US National Forest Stewardship Standard, where we've been, where we're going, what we anticipate this process will look like for in the coming year or so. I am also going to provide a very brief overview of the consultation materials for those of you who have not yet had an opportunity to dig into the materials that are available to you. But the intent is for those two elements to be just a small part of our time today, and that the focus of today's webinar is actually to have a question and answer session. So a couple of things to remember. Please submit your questions using the Q&A box. If you look at the bottom, you'll see that you have a chat box and you have a Q&A box. So please use the Q&A box for submitting questions. We will also give you an opportunity to raise your hand and look for participants with raised hands. Finally, we are recording this webinar so that it will be available for others to view. And so therefore, we're asking you to please keep that in mind and also make sure that you remain muted if you're not speaking. Okay, so from there, overall, as we look at this revision process, the Standard Development Group identified at the beginning back in before we began the actual active activities in 2018, the Standard Development Group identified that they really wanted to try, to the extent possible, to maintain continuity and consistency with our existing standard, while recognizing that we do need to align with the revised FSC principles and criteria, that's version 5, whereas our current standard is under principles and criteria version 4, and also the international generic indicators, which we frequently refer to as IGIs. There were a handful of high priority issues that have been highlighted during both the draft 1 consultation and this draft 2 consultation. And then there are some elements of guidance that have been in use, but were not formally adopted into the standard. For example, guidance related to high conservation values. And so these are all of the elements that are really the focus for overall for the revision process. The Standard Development Group has identified that they would like to focus on clarity of intent for indicators, while also focusing on feasibility for certificate holders when it comes to implementation of activities for conformance with the standard. But all of this obviously needs to be done while respecting FSC's core values. Okay, so where are we at in the revision process? We started the kind of active part of this process in 2018, and that led to our first public consultation of draft 1. It was separated into 2 phases. In the first phase, which included the basic indicators that would be applicable to most certificate holders, as well as most of the guidance annexes. That phase 1 was ended in December of 2022. And then the phase 2 public consultation, which covered the supplementary requirements for federal lands and the indicators that were specifically for plantations and those for family forests. That consultation occurred earlier in Q1 of 2021. We've now had an opportunity to work with the Standard Development Group to consider those comments and come back with a draft 2 standard. And we're in the middle of this consultation. It ends next Tuesday, and this covers all of the elements of the standard. Looking forward, the intent is to submit in November of this year. We anticipate that it will take FSC International a period of time to review and go through the approval process, and we'll probably have some things that we need to work out with them. So we're anticipating that approval and publication of the revised standard will likely not occur before the end of 2023. If this is the case, then the standard will generally become effective. That means that somebody could be audited to it 3 months later, so early in 2024, and that would be the beginning of the 12-month transition period. Every certificate holder does need to be audited to the revised standard during that transition period. And throughout this time, once the standard is approved, FSC US will have a focus on implementation support and working to provide resources and tools that can be used by certificate holders to help work on conformance with the standard. All right, so this is, again, it's just really briefly an overview, a summary of the comments that we received on draft 1. For phase 1, we received 54 sets of unique comments representing 61 entities. And then in phase 2, each one, there were 3 separate consultations, received a small number of unique sets of comments, but they were representing a significant number of entities. The one thing that I want to call to your attention is that the Standard Development Group did in fact look at and consider all of the comments that were received, and that was just under 4,000 individual comments. So there was a lot to work through and figure out there. But each one of these was considered There's a very, very small number that have been pushed forward to draft 3. But in the most part, in the materials that are provided for this consultation, you can see that the Standard Development Group did consider all of these comments. So a couple of last reminders about this consultation. Comments are welcome through May 31, 2022. That's next Tuesday. And I'll just remind you very briefly that the end of May 31, 2022 in the consultation platform is actually based on Central European time. So you need to think about that related to your time zone. And for those on the East Coast, this means that the consultation will close at 6 p.m. And then for other time zones, you can work your way through that. There's a link to the consultation platform from the engagement website here, engageusfsc.org. And there are additional resources available for there. I'll remind you about those briefly. The scope of this consultation is all elements of the standard: the base indicators, the family forest indicators, the plantation indicators, the supplementary requirements for federal lands, and also the annexes. Okay, so if you want to write in a question about the revision process itself, you are welcome to do so, or if you would like to raise your hand if you have any questions about that process, please let us know. And I am not seeing anything offhand.
We have 3 questions, Amy.
Yep, they are, I believe, related to the content of the standard and not about the process. So other than Robert Ruby's, I see your question is more process related. Is the intent to maintain version 4 of the principles and criteria as the framework for the U.S. National Forest Stewardship Standard? No. The scope of this revision process includes aligning with principle and criteria version 5. And the international generic indicators. So in terms of this process, the intent is to align our US standard with principle and criteria version 5. Okay. I don't see any raised hands. So just a brief overview of the consultation materials.
There are some questions, Amy, in the question and answer box, 2 from Mr. Heidi and 1 from.
Yes, and those I think are more content related.
There's one from Doug Brown. Will there be an additional time to comment after this draft is done?
I see that. I missed it. It was below my screen. Thank you very much. No, well, there will be on a very small, in a very small way. So this is the last formal public consultation. We are not required to hold another formal public consultation. Draft 3 will be the draft that is submitted for approval to FSC International. However, there is one element related to the supplementary requirements for federal lands that has been identified as potentially needing additional focused or targeted consultation. So on that element, the Standard Development Group may reach out to, and will likely reach out to, the members of the consultative forum to ask for additional feedback. If there are any other issues that come up for the Standard Development Group that they would like to get some additional feedback on those issues, then they will use the consultative forum for feedback. But we are not planning to hold another full public consultation period. So hopefully that answers your question, Doug.
Amy, the glossary and the definitions are part of this consultation process. Is that
correct? Yes. The glossary, and just as a reminder, the glossary itself is the only one of the annexes that's normative. The remainder of the annexes are guidance. So it is an important part of the standard and also therefore important part of the consultation. Okay. I am not, the others are focused on the elements of the standard. Okay. And I just move forward. Quick reminder that on the website that we have for FSC US, the website listed up here, there are 2 versions of the draft 2 standard. One includes the track changes, and that's changes made between draft 1 and draft 2. And then there is a version which is clean, so you can look at the final proposed wording without the track changes. The consultation report highlights changes that were made from draft 1 to draft 2. There's 2 versions of the report. One version, which is labeled without annexes, does not include all of the itemized comments that were received. We recommend that you start with that one unless you're specifically looking for an individual comment, because the version that includes all of those comments has an additional 400 pages. So it's a very big document. There is an Excel workbook, which was used by the standard development group and staff to summarize and track comments, and then the standard development group's response to those comments. And the website includes links to, I guess that should say webinar recordings, as this is our second and final webinar, links to the consultation platform, and an email for additional questions. This was just a set of suggestions for how to go about looking at the consultation materials. We recommend that you start by looking at the consultation report, that you then look at the draft 2 track changes version of the standard with the information from the consultation report in mind. If you have a specific question about why a change was implemented and it's not addressed in the consultation report, then we recommend that you look at the Excel workbook, as that should generally provide information. And then finally, if you have any additional questions, you can send them to the fm.revision website that you see there. It's also available from the website. And finally, submit your comments. Please, please. Okay, so those are the slides that I had. If there are any questions about the consultation materials, please let us know. You can raise your hand, you can type it in the Q&A box. For those of you who are registered on Friday, I gave you an opportunity to provide questions in advance and indicated that these would be prioritized. So for the questions submitted in advance, we're going to go through, there's about a half a dozen of those. We'll go through those first, and then we'll move to the questions in the Q&A box, and then we will also give folks an opportunity to raise their hand and ask questions directly. Okay. So the first 2 here are actually linked together, but we received a comment as much as a question about the definition of affected stakeholder. In the glossary, affected stakeholders defined as any person, group of persons or entity that is or has a high probability of being subject to the effects of the activities of a management unit. And then it goes on to say that there could be many different kinds of individuals or entities that could be affected stakeholders, including but not limited to individuals who are in the neighborhood of the management unit. And then there's another bulleted list of potential examples. And one of these examples is neighbors. And the comment / question was that there's a concern here that neighbors may not necessarily hold a stake in the management of a certified management unit and therefore are not true stakeholders. This is, I would identify that the definition we are using is the global definition of affected stakeholder used throughout the FSC normative framework. While we are allowed to change those definitions, we do need to provide a rationale or a justification for doing so. I'm going to ask our panelists, this is not exactly a question, but is there anything here on which any of you would like to provide a little bit of feedback from your perspective? And if not, I'll just link it into the next question. Okay, no, all right. So this is something that we would encourage you to provide a comment for if you're concerned about this in the consultation, and the standard development group can take a look at it again. It's linked into the next question, which is about criterion 1.6. That criterion reads, the organization shall identify, prevent, and resolve disputes over issues of statutory or customary law, which can be settled out of court in a timely manner through engagement with affected stakeholders. And the question is, does the draft standard require identifying, preventing, and resolving disputes that are outside statutory and customary law? So there's a couple of things here that I would say in response, and then I'm going to ask the standard development group members, your panelists, if they have something additional they'd like to share. But number one, I'd like to remind you that the indicators associated with criterion 1.6 actually have scope beyond criterion 1.6. This is an unusual situation. But because criterion 1.6, criterion 2.6, and criterion 4.6 are so similar in intent related to having a dispute resolution process to address different issues in different parts of the standard development group made a decision to pull the relevant indicators into one location instead of repeating them multiple times in the standard. So while the indicators are actually housed under criterion 1.6, they address conformance also with criterion 2.6 and criterion 4.6. They also address an element of criterion 3.2, specifically indicator 323, which is about disputes resulting from potential violations of Indigenous peoples' rights. So while the criterion 1.6 says this, and yes, it's focused on law, the scope of the indicators actually are broader than that, and they address workers' rights, they address rights that may be held by communities, they address rights that may be held by Indigenous peoples. And in fact, criterion 4.6 also brings in elements of affected stakeholders. And I think this is where the previous question possibly is relevant, that criterion 4.6 addresses disputes that may be brought by either local communities that have rights or other affected stakeholders. So the response is that to the question, does the draft standard require identifying, preventing, and resolving disputes that are outside statutory and customary law? The answer to that is yes, but that's because those indicators, the 4 indicators of criterion 1.6, are addressing other elements of the standard as well. Indicator 161 provides a pretty specific set of the issues and disputes that are addressed under criterion 1.6 indicators. So if you look at 1.6.1, that gives you the 4 potential types of disputes that are addressed by the indicators that are under 1.6. Okay, anything additional that any of you would like to add, or since you guys are able to listen to me, if you heard something that was not clear, please also make sure that we bring that up or address it right now. Okay. Hearing nothing, I'm going to move to the next question. The next several questions that were submitted in advance were related to Principle 2. At the beginning of Principle 2, there is guidance that identifies or states that in some situations, oversight for conformance to Principle 2 indicators by independent contractors and contractor employees may not be possible for the organization due to the independent legal status of the independent contractor. However, for indicators that apply to all workers, the independent contractors or to independent contractors and or to contractor employees, it will still be the responsibility of the organization to provide evidence of conformance by these individuals. For example, the following indicator does not, oh, I'm sorry. This should have been colored green. The comment from the person who submitted this question indicated that for indicator 213, there's no clear specificity that this applies to all workers, independent contractors, and or contractor employees. And so therefore, their question is, does the certificate holder need to provide evidence of compliance with this indicator for buyers of timber, for independent contractors, or others who are not employees of the certificate holder? The simple answer to this is yes. There is an applicability note associated with criterion 2.1. That applicability note indicates that the 4 indicators in criterion 2.1 are applicable to all workers. So workers would include employees of the certificate holder, contractors, and subcontractors who are, and then if you look at the definition, you'll see that this is the scope of these individuals are people who are implementing management activities within the scope of the management unit. So buyers of timber would only be included in the scope if they're implementing management activities, or if they are felling the timber, then yes, they would be considered workers within the management unit. Independent contractors, yes, and others who are fit that definition of workers. So that is employees, independent contractors, and or contractor employees. Those would all be within the scope, the applicability of this particular indicator. We've been working on this, the indicators in criterion 2.1 are directly related to the FSC core labor requirements. We've been working with chain of custody certificate holders on these as well. And it may be that there's potentially some possibility of some additional guidance here, but I don't know. For those of you, maybe Shona, you worked on some of the Principle 2 items. Any thoughts to share as it relates to this question?
I mean, I think you gave a great response, Amy, and I think the important factor here is work related to forest management. And so I think it's a great question, and we'll see as these get field tested and implemented, if there are ways that they might need to be refined. But thanks for the great question, and I think that was a great answer. Nothing to add.
All right, thank you. I think we've got a couple more that are Principle 2 related. Okay, criterion 2.4. The organization shall pay wages that meet or exceed minimum forestry standards or other recognized forest industry wage agreements or living wages where these are higher than the legal minimum wages. When none of these exist, the organization shall, through engagement with workers, develop mechanisms for determining living wages. Okay, so number one, I would remind everyone that when you're audited for conformance with indicators and not directly for conformance with the criterion. The intent is that the indicators will in fact result in conformance with the criterion. But when you're assessed by an auditor, it's to the indicators, while they may reference the criterion for intent and things to think about. So the question is, what does none of these refer to? Does it refer to minimum forest industry standards or other recognized forest industry wage agreements, living wages, or all of those plus legal minimum wages? So I don't know that this is actually a question. This is something that I think we would really need to look at very, very carefully, and perhaps even reference or go back to the Policy and Standards Unit in Bond if we really needed a very, very specific answer. When I believe the Standard Development Group, we did look at this, we did ask ourselves the same question. I think that when working on developing and defining the indicators, the number one thing is that we looked more closely at the international generic indicators to determine what's there and what's expected. I do believe that as it was discussed, the belief is that the intent is B, not A. So looking at the different possible ways that a living wage could potentially be defined, and that, you know, you start with legal. If any of the others are higher than legal, then you would need to look at those instead. And then if none of them, and the none of them I believe is reference to B, which includes the legal minimum wage, then the organization would need to go through the engagement process. This is why in the existing draft 2 standard, there's not anything in there about developing mechanisms for determining living wage, because we have legal minimum wages in the US. So this was kind of the thought process, and again, building from the international generic indicators as opposed to specifically from the criterion in this situation.
Amy, I just also highlight that we do have a targeted consultation question around this topic of living wage. If folks would like to provide more feedback, there's a good spot for that.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Stuart.
I thought, Amy, that we were trying to go for living wage or minimum kind of industry wages, where those are above minimum wage. So
I think I think you're right, Shona. That's the intent of the indicators, which is why I'm hoping that folks will look at the indicators and not specifically at the criterion.
Yeah,
You're unable to change the criterion. If you're asking for an interpretation of the criterion, I believe it references, you know, all of the things that come before, but none of these exist. If none of these exist, and therefore the requirement for engagement with workers to develop mechanisms for determining living wages, I don't think that we looked at that as being applicable in this scenario, and therefore the indicators don't focus on that. So it's a question about the criterion, but really we would like to have comments that are focused on the indicators. Okay. Okay, another one from Principle 2, Indicator 263 says that the organization contracts with independent contractors that carry workers' compensation insurance for contractor employees. The person who submitted the question noted that many are in different parts of the country. Logging companies may be legally exempt from providing workers' comp. And the question is, does 263 apply to the owners of logging companies in places where there's legal exemption? And I'm going to ask, Shona, I know you worked on this and I want to ask for confirmation, but my understanding, the way that the indicators were written, The intent is that, yes, this would be applicable to any independent contractor who has contractor employees, but that it would not be applicable to a sole proprietor, regardless of the legal framework. That was my understanding, but I would like to hear from you if that's possible.
Pushing my memory here. This is quite a while ago, but I thought we even had something in here at one point about, I see, we have an intent statement.
Okay.
I'm looking at the indicators now. So not all states require the organization to maintain insurance, and some states have exemptions. So it's intended to address, okay, I think that's what you were saying here. Yep. Those that have it and those that, and those that don't. So yeah.
Yep. Okay. So that would be the answer, is that yes, it does apply to logging companies who have contractor employees in areas where there's a legal exemption. Okay. If this is something that's a concern to you, then again, we would encourage you to submit comments as part of the consultation. Moving to principle 4, which is about local communities. Indicator 451 says that through culturally appropriate engagement with local communities, the organization identifies significant negative social, environmental, and economic community level impacts that are likely to result from management activities. And there's a question about the expectation for engagement with communities. And that for some groups, FM groups, forest management groups, this could be an extensive expectation with large numbers of group members. And the question is there an expectation for proactive engagement with all of the local communities? And yes, for conformance with indicator 451, there is an expectation for engagement with the local communities where the management activities could have an impact on the different elements of the social, environmental, and economic values associated for that community. So the answer is yes. Okay. Representative sample areas. The question is about the expectation that representative sample areas are to be established within the management unit, except in a limited number of situations. There's concern expressed here about this and the potential benefits. I think that we could have a very long philosophical discussion about the benefit to be gained by requiring representative sample areas within almost all forest management units. I think that perhaps the intent or the thing that's really important to share is it has been very, very clearly communicated from FSC International that with the exception of the flexibility that's provided by the forest management group standard, which was recently revised and approved, with the exception of the flexibility provided there, they will not approve a standard that does not include this expectation around criterion 6.5, that there is an expectation for representative sample areas and the conservation areas network. That's the criterion 6.5 as a whole. It has been made clear that there is an expectation that criterion 6.5 will be, there will be conformance within forest management units with the exception of the flexibility that's provided by the forest management group standard. So then that is where the next question, that can RSAs be shared within a group certificate? The answer to that is yes. For the members of the group that meet the definition of the small or low intensity managed forests, which we call family forests. So for the members of the group that meet that threshold for SLIMF, or the small or low intensity managed forests, yes, then the responsibility can be shared between the group members, either the SLIMF members of the group or the larger members of the group. However, the larger members of the group do have their own responsibilities when it comes to RSAs. Okay. The next question is about conservation areas network. And do regulatory defined riparian areas qualify for the conservation areas network? I think the guidance indicates that the answer to this would be yes. I think that it's more important to think about what the intent of the conservation areas network is. The intent is that these are areas that are identified as having a purpose for conserving environmental or cultural values. And so it will be the responsibility of the certificate holder to then provide an explanation as to why they identified a particular area for being part of the conservation areas network. One way of looking at it is, you know, when you are managing in a particular area, are you adapting or adjusting what you might have done had it been somewhere else? You know, are you adjusting or adapting to ensure that you are conserving particular environmental or cultural values? In the case of a riparian area, I think that that would be generally a pretty clear yes, if you're adapting your management to ensure that you are in fact conserving the riparian habitat, and or if you are, you know, working to ensure that you are maintaining other environmental elements associated with the riparian corridor. So any, for these questions, any additional thoughts or comments from any of you who are in our panel today?
This is Stuart. I would just kind of echo, I think, what you just said there, Amy. I think a lot of it's thinking about how the values that you define, you know, through your management plan and through the early parts of Principle 6, and then, you know, where those values are applied and where you're managing for those values. So where you're managing for these, you know, conservation values, these ecological values, then those might be the places that would be more suitable.
Okay, great. Okay, this is the last of the questions that were submitted in advance. There's a question, is there an adjacency requirement relative to plantations in the Southeast? Plantation indicator 6653 says yes, but plantation indicator 6655 seems to reverse this requirement for Southeast region plantations, but not explicitly enough to be clear that the adjacency requirement does not apply. Okay, so at this point, I'm actually going to 6653 and 6655. I'm going to back out of this presentation and pull up a quick version of the standard. I thought I had this open, there it is. So that we can all see, because I don't have everything memorized, as I'm sure you guys don't either. So going to 6653 and 6655. We'll get there at some point. And still not there. Sorry about this. Okay, so 6653, before a regeneration harvest is conducted, regeneration in adjacent forested areas on the management unit must be of the subsequent advanced successional habitat stage or exceed 10 feet in height or achieve canopy closure along at least 50% of the perimeter. So the question is, does that requirement conflict with 6655 associated with the southeast region? Harvest units are arranged to support viable populations of native species of flora and fauna. Regeneration and prior harvest opening. Okay, I see the concern with the question here. I'm not sure that this is something we can answer right at this moment. So I will definitely, unless one of our panelists sees something that I'm not at the moment, I think this is going to be a dig in and see if we can word these a little bit more clearly to make it obvious whether there is a change, an exception for the Southeast or not. Now that I have this question, we can make a note of it to take a look at it as a standard development group. Would also encourage you to submit the comment that there's the potential conflict or a lack of clarity here. Would encourage you to submit that in your comments. So thank you. Okay, so then while we've been talking, we've had 3 questions submitted from those of you who are participating in the webinar today. The number 1 question is there a scientific basis for the 10% of conservation areas network? If there isn't a scientific basis, what is the justification or thinking around this new requirement? Okay, so the standard development group actually asked exactly this question. And I can go back and review things, but pulling it out of my memory, my understanding is that there has been some work through the International Policy and Standards Committee and the Performance and Standards Unit over the years prior to kind of this most recent revision of national standards to look at the question around how much is enough and what was the desired amount of conservation areas that was really going to have an impact as it relates to global concerns about changing habitats and biodiversity losses and things of that nature. My memory is that when they did a review of scientific studies that were looking at what was the appropriate amount to have in a conservation status, it ranged everywhere. It ranged up to 50%, but that there was a conclusion when the IGI, before the international generic indicators were developed, there was a conclusion this was too high. It would not be feasible for forest management units. And so therefore they looked at a range of options, some folks pushing for higher, some for lower, and they came to the resolution for the international generic indicators at this 10%. So that's kind of the bit of history that we have and understand about this. If there's additional need for information, then please feel free to reach out for me and I can dig back into the notes that I had developed on this for the standard development group. All right. The next question, oh, wait. I think there was a hand up. Let's go through these questions that have been typed in. There were 3 of them, and then can go and ask if there are hands. Did the Standard Development Group consider that many or most public lands in the US have multiple use and a conservation mandate? Could public lands, particularly county and state forest, be exempted from the Conservation Areas Network requirement? The feedback that I'm getting is that it will require a lot of work to assess and designate a Conservation Areas Network and then track through future years without obvious conservation benefit. The Standard Development Group is able to submit a standard that they believe is taking and applying the principles and criteria, version 5, and the international generic indicators, and then adapting to a US context. However, we look at this within also the context of that feedback that I previously mentioned from FSC International, that this is a requirement that they have thus far indicated that the only flexibility around criterion 6.5 is that which is given in the forest management group standard. If the Standard Development Group wanted to discuss this and felt very strongly that this was the direction they wanted to go, this is something that they could consider. There's no guarantee that it would be approved. We'd have to provide some really, really, really strong rationale and justifications, but even then, it might not be approved. But there's nothing stopping the Standard Development Group from discussing and considering this and then making a decision on whether or not they believe that within the guidance that we have, this is something that they would like to move forward to the final draft. I feel like I've been talking a lot, but any thoughts from any of you? Okay. All right, so just in terms of kind of a mental note that I will try and bring back to the Standard Development Group, and also would ask that you as individuals who are submitting comments, that you do provide this comment in the consultation platform, but just thinking about as the Standard Development Groups, the feasibility versus the benefit and the value. All right, I had said there were 2 more, and then we'll go to the hands. And then there's another one after that, but I don't want to lose track of which came first. Okay, the NFSS Draft 2 document has language where, and this is in quotes, the organization is encouraged to consider the overlap of goals when designing configurations of special management areas in order to maximize the environmental, social, and economic values of the forest. The comment is that this is a little nuts and bolts, but how will we be asked to report areas, i.e. acres, that have multiple designations, e.g. something that is a high conservation value and also a representative sample area and is also a riparian management zone. I realize that the question is nuts and bolts. And in fact, I think that the response is that the way that this is done may be different from one certificate holder to the next. And it would depend on what is that certificate holder's framework or process for tracking within the organization and associated with the management plan. And it may be very different from one to the next, whether it's through GIS or whether it's through some other type of demonstration or documentation. It will depend on the processes that work and make the most sense for that particular certificate holder. I don't think that I've got anything more specific for this question.
Amy, this is Stuart, and I can't remember the specifics of the details either, but it might be worth revisiting, the new documentations that you're probably seeing on electronic reporting that are coming from FSC, because I think within that, there is some, kind of the way they ask for data for certain fields, I think may help kind of provide some additional insights around this. So it may be worth having a look at that also in terms of how they're asking for the new reporting that's coming in electronically.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks. All right, one more question and then we'll go to the hands. Indicator 262. Oh, I'm still sharing my screen. I can stop that for now. Sorry, guys. Indicator 262. The organization contracts with independent contractors that have a dispute resolution process for disputes raised by contractor employees. Oh, I see the question is the next one down. Is this placing too much of a burden on small independent contractors who usually have less than a handful of employees? The current process today is pretty straightforward, as they're typically working alongside the contractor. The employee has numerous opportunities to raise concerns. So I think that the important thing here is that it says that the organization contracts with independent contractors that have a dispute resolution process for disputes raised by their employees. So that the expectation there is that they have formally identified and described in some way how they deal with disputes. This does not say that it has to be huge and highly complicated, has, a very specific framework or anything like that. It's that they have a way of dealing with disputes. And so then the contractor would need to be able to describe to the auditor if asked, or to the organization if asked, how they deal with disputes and what's their process. So I think that that's the expectation there. Okay. So with that, I think that we have, looks like one hand is raised. All right, so normally this is somebody else handling this part. So Ross, I'm gonna try and I'm gonna click. And then I think that you need to also unmute yourself.
Can you hear me, Amy?
Yes, we can hear you. Okay, go for it.
Thanks. I just wanted to say that, regarding the representative sample area and conservation areas network point, as a group, and I think probably other groups are struggling with this, the question fundamentally as to who really gets audited to this? Is it the group manager who's dealing with the calculations of RSAs and conservation areas, or is it the landowner? Because I fundamentally have a problem with signing up landowners and telling them, no, if you do not have an RSA, you cannot be part of FSC. And so I'm concerned about the current wording in the standard and the way that this is being looked at in relation to what's needed for RSAs and conservation areas networks. And I think that that's something that I'd like to hear what the intent is from the team. And also, do we feel like the intent is actually being met? And the one last part I'll say is I'm concerned that the international threshold cutoff for this of 122 acres or whatever it is probably from somewhere that I don't know where it is. And now we've got two different definitions for sloops and what you actually have to audit to. And I'm also quite concerned about that. Thanks.
So my first response for us would be similar to all aspects of how groups are managed. There may be difference from one group to the next, depending on how that group has defined responsibilities. So that's one of the great things about the forest management group standard, is that it allows the flexibility for different responsibilities to be held by different parts of the group, whether it's the group entity or group members or a resource manager, or a contractor, that there is going to be potentially some difference depending on where that responsibility has been defined by the group. In terms of your concern, I hear you, and I do hear your concern, and would encourage you to include this in your comments. I am going to turn back to our panelists for today to ask if they have some additional thoughts, but certainly we can look at it again with the standard development group. If you have specific suggestions for how the indicators could be rewritten to address the issues that are in the IGIs, or the elements of the IGIs, but do it in a way that you feel would be more feasible, then I would really encourage you to do that. Having those kinds of comments and suggestions for specific edits and changes are really, really helpful. Tim, Stuart, Shona, any additional thoughts there?
I guess I would just, echo what Amy's saying in terms of, particularly if you have, specifics around language that might be helpful. I think we're trying to, find solutions to challenges that have been provided, and we're looking, for options, and we're trying to propose things, and we're trying to think about this stuff more broadly, such that, not only can we make it work, but that we can make it successful. And so, particularly if there's specifics there, I think we would appreciate those. And I think we also, hear your concerns and want to try to find better solutions if we can.
Thanks, Stuart. Okay, so then I'm back to I'm figuring out how to handle the hands up and down. Sorry. Maggie is wonderful at this, and I'm learning. So moving back to our Q&A, questions that have been submitted. I've got one that says, regarding HCV areas and harvesting systems in general. So HCV being high conservation values areas, and harvesting systems in general, the trend is that machines are becoming excessively large, requiring significant ground coverage, space requirements, and excessive ground pressure. In many areas, these new systems are becoming the only systems available. Does the revised standard, I think this means, address this trend and place limits on mechanized harvester size limits or seasonality of use, particularly on sensitive sites, bottomlands, or natural upland hardwood sites? My initial response, and I'm going to look to the rest of the panels here, is that while this was not a very specific element that was brought into the standard development group discussions, because the intent of our indicators is that they are outcome oriented and that you're not having negative impacts as the result of equipment use, then the size of the equipment really should not be an issue, because the same outcome is intended for any kind of equipment. But any thoughts there?
No, I think that's right. I would say, there's kind of all of the other indicators within the standard around soils and compaction and other things that this would be audited against. So if the equipment was causing those problems, then it would certainly, or should be captured there. And I don't know that we've looked specifically. I mean, there are considerations around equipment and harvesting operations, that require you to have a look at, but I don't think we've addressed like the size of the equipment anywhere specifically. Just like Amy said, it's kind of captured in the other parts of the standard related to those resources that it may be impacting.
Okay. All right, the next question actually looks like there's three sort of linked together here, have to do with planting of Norway spruce. So regarding 10.2.1 and 10.2.2, which is about regeneration following harvest, will the continued planting of Norway spruce disqualify a certificate holder from maintaining their certified status? So I would, this might also be addressed under indicator 10.11.3. Okay. This issue was discussed. The intent of the regeneration indicators is that there is not an intentional maintenance of stands that are non-native species. I think that there was discussion, my memory is discussion with the standard development group specifically around Norway spruce, that there is not an expectation here that there's an immediate a change to something else, that there might, Norway spruce might still be a component within a forest, a certified managed forest, but that I believe the intent here is that a replant to a Norway spruce forest would not be in conformance with the indicators around regeneration unless there is some other ecological or intent or rationale or purpose. I mean, we have the new elements there that are intend to be more clear about when non-native species may be used for regeneration. So if it fit there, but otherwise it would not be, I believe it would not be considered to be in conformance with the revised standard as written in draft 2. And I assume that you guys are taking a quick look at those indicators as well. But if you have anything you'd like to add. No, okay. So Scott, if you want to follow up on that at all, you're welcome to raise your hand and let us know if you want to follow up on the question about regeneration. Okay. Oh, those two are actually related to something else. So, oh, we do have a hand up. Okay. Robert, I am giving you the ability to unmute yourself. So
Great.
please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Just to getting back to the equipment situation here in Lake States, this is becoming an issue, particularly in hardwood stands. And, you know, most of our hardwood stands are cut in winter conditions. So it's usually not, ground pressure is usually not a big issue. But on state forests, which are FSC certified, I mean, I live in amongst these forests, so I see these timber sales that are being conducted very recently. I'm also a practicing forester, and I have timber sales that I manage. Anyway, the trend is very strong towards these very large harvesting systems. And in order for these machines even to operate in the woods, they require to create swaths through the forest. And so and this is on state land, it's FSC certified, and it's excessive. There's no question about it. And the result, maybe we have the provisions or the indicators that would catch that, but they're not being caught at the moment. This is something that could really come back to bite us. And I know, for my professional opinion, is that these are causing it's causing damage. It's causing system-wide damage to the forest. So anyway, I just want, because it's a new trend, it's not a new trend, it's probably it's been 20 years in the development. And just, you could go back to the Menominee Forest, which is kind of state-of-the-art forest here in the Lake States. They've had major restrictions on the size of the machines that can operate in their forest, primarily in those hardwood stands in the moraine, where you have slopes and you have heavier ground and that sort of thing. So I just want to bring it to your attention. I'm hoping that the new norms will catch this. In the case of the Menominee, they put restrictions on the size of the machines that can go into the forest. So again, it's just kind of a new trend, a developing trend. It's becoming the norm, because the old foresters with their smaller shortwood operations are basically going away. And the new operations are getting larger and larger and larger. And this is, I think, an unsustainable way to harvest in these forests. Anyway, just bring that up to your attention. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Robert, I would really encourage you to, as part of your review of the draft 2 standard, to take a really close look at the indicators that address soil compaction and rutting and things of that nature, and encourage you to suggest, like I said to one of the previous commenters, I encourage you to suggest specific language or additional elements of those indicators as you think would be appropriate to address this concern. We encourage you to do it so that the indicators focus on outcomes, because that's
Sure.
the expectation of FSC.
I'll do that. And I
Yeah.
have looked at those areas, and I don't think they're being addressed, but I will suggest maybe some wording.
Yeah.
It's really an issue of the space requirement for these machines to move through the forest. They're creating essentially strip clear cuts in the forest, which is a very different type of silvicultural system.
Okay. And that may be a different issue
anyway,
from rutting and compaction, but
it's a different issue that's
definitely-
not being addressed in the indicators. Yeah.
Okay, so please ask
Yes.
you to bring that forward. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to go to one question that we have in the Q&A, and then we have another hand up, and I'll come back to you, Mark, in just a second. The Q&A question is, in Wisconsin, the county forest program has 21 counties under the certificate, a multi-site certificate. For the conservation areas network, 10%, would like the certificate as a whole to meet that requirement and not down to the individual county management unit. A small ownership county forest has 5%, another has 15%, so the overall is met. I think that it's a difference whether you're talking about a single certificate that has multiple sites associated with that single certificate, or whether you're talking about a group. If this is in fact a single certificate and is not audited to the forest management group standard, then it's 10% as a whole, considering all of the sites. However, the expectation as laid out in the guidance for criterion 6.5 and the representative sample areas and the separately for the conservation areas network. Oh, this is specific to conservation areas. I'm sorry, ignore my reference to representative sample areas. But this would be 10% over the entirety of the certificate. So that's the way that the indicators are written. If it's a group, it can be handled slightly differently. So if that didn't answer your question, Doug, let us know, please. Okay, I am going to click and make it possible for Mark Heidi to unmute himself. Mark, can you do that?
I think so.
There you go. We
All
got
right.
it.
So you just on, actually my follow-up was on Robert Simeone's comments, but for Doug's question as well, you were going to add in something about RSAs. That's also maybe a helpful comment. Is it the same that it's one certificate, multi-sites, that RSAs would be considered over the whole? I mean, it's one certificate.
Yeah, I think that RSAs, it's one certificate, and the expectation for the indicators for RSAs are written at the management unit level, and the certificate is, associated directly with the management unit unless you're dealing with groups. So, but on representative sample areas, you are, if you look at the guidance for representative sample areas, you are expected to look at, the typical natural or ecosystems that would be expected to occur, that may or may not be currently occurring within the management unit. So I think that provides a slightly different element, because you would need to consider the ecosystems, that would occur on the different parts
Sure.
of that multi-part site or
Yeah,
multi-site certificate.
And the standards development group, though, did make the change that RSAs can be considered that are protected by others in the same landscape.
Very limited exceptions there. In the guidance, that's laid out that those may be considered if the certificate holder was responsible for, or somehow, I'm paraphrasing here, but was a part of ensuring that those areas were in fact conserved. So it's a fairly limited exception.
Oh, I didn't read it that way. I'll have to reread it.
Okay, if it
That's
doesn't.
an unhelpful exception. I
Okay,
mean, because the state, like the state of Wisconsin, has a whole state natural areas system where many different ecosystem and forest types are protected. And it's very unhelpful not to be able to reference those areas because it's another certificate holder, or not a certificate holder, doesn't have to be FSC certified.
Okay, so I would encourage you, Mark, to go back and look at the guidance, and I think it's Annex G. And just if it's not clear, or if you feel that it's creating a scenario of that nature, then please, provide comments and let us know.
I think
Sure.
in the annex too, I mean, the adjacent and the landscape is given considerations in terms of the expectation on the FMU. So if that cover type is well represented within the landscape, but off the FMU, then there isn't the expectation that you would have it as well represented on necessarily, right? So there is that, kind of influence at the FMU level from the landscape perspective as well.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, I'm not talking about taking credit for acres or something like that. It's if something's already protected. It would make sense not to have to protect it if it's already adequately protected. But okay, I'll take another look at that. And related to Robert Simeone's comments, it's not true to my understanding that large harvesting systems equal higher ground pressure. In many cases, a larger equipment has a lower ground pressure. Matching equipment to the site and the management objectives has been an issue for 30 years. And the tools exist to do that. And I don't think it would be feasible nor desirable to try to put something in a forest management standard, because I think the requirements for protecting ecosystems and all the aspects that are already in the standard cover the situation. If there's ecological damage happening, well, shame on the forest manager, and it should get caught. It should get picked up in an audit without having equipment related criteria and indicators. Just my 2 cents. That's it.
All right, thank you, Mark. All right, we do not currently have any typed questions in our Q&A box. I don't see any hands raised. We've got about 5 minutes left in the webinar today. Since we've got this time, I would ask the panelists, or we actually have a couple of other standard development group members in the webinar today. If any of you, if there's something additional that any of you would like to share or comment or just reflect on, would encourage you, if you're a panelist, you get to speak up and say yourself, or if you're in the webinar and want to raise your hand, certainly we can give you the floor. So
I would just kind of reiterate what Stuart had said earlier. We would appreciate when you submit comments in the platform. And for those of you that haven't opened the platform yet, there's about a page set up for each of the criteria, a page set up for the glossary. So, you know, it's not as in depth as it was in the last consultation at the indicator level, but give yourself some time, and we really appreciate very focused and pointed input, not the generalities of we'd prefer not to do this, or we don't like, you know, this criterion, but a very focus on what you might recommend as a change. We've been working on this standard now from the working group up through the standard development group and the Policy and Standards Committee for multiple years. And as Amy explained, our target is November to pass this as a finished product off to FSC International. And as she also said, we actually reviewed, Amy and her team, or the Policy and Standards Committee, just under 4,000 comments in the last go around. And we would really hope that at this stage that there's much less in number of comments and much more focused and targeted input in this consultation. So again, I just follow through, help us to not have another year of conversations, but very focused decisions on a path forward. We feel as a standard development group and as the Policy and Standards Committee that this is a good draft. We feel that we've come a long way from draft one as far as making it feasible, increasing clarity, reducing complexity, streamlining, making it feasible for all the parties, all the potential landowners that could become certified under this standard. And when we, you know, though we may have had individual concerns as a standard development group, we gave it our unanimous approval to move forward for consultation. I believe this is a very feasible standard, although it does have its complexities for whomever would be certified under the standard.
great.
I would just also add that it has been a long process. We really appreciate everyone sticking with us throughout it and taking the time to submit your comments. And, we have been working on it, or we feel like we are getting there, but we also recognize that, especially those of you that are implementing these standards on a daily basis, also have a lot to contribute. And so we, again, really welcome your suggestions and examples and pointed feedback. So thanks everyone so much for your participation. We really appreciate it.
Yes.
Yeah, I would just like to, echo what the others have said. We really appreciate, the feedback, the specifics. If you can get it to the indicator, that's most helpful for us. We can't change the criteria, but we can work with the indicators, and so that's most helpful. And then I would just like to, and I know I speak on behalf of everyone, thank you all for showing up. I mean, 30 or 40 people have shown up this afternoon to spend an hour and a half talking about this stuff. It's obvious that you all have spent more time looking at it and digging into it and everything else. And I just can't express our gratitude for your help and us thinking through this collectively. So really appreciate it.
I agree. The last thing I would say is that, as noted, there's a question at the beginning of the consultation platform. If you would like to be included in the consultative forum, to please check the box. The folks in the consultative forum are the ones who will receive any targeted questions for feedback as the standard development group moves into working on draft 3. So if you'd like to be included in that targeted consultation, please make sure you check the box at the consultative forum. And otherwise, thank you so very, very, very much for your participation today and throughout this process. And with that, I think we're going to shut this down. So thank you, and I hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.